Hello and welcome to this very special edition of Business Plus on Friday, where we have a special guest who's going to help us understand the various factors impacting our economy, the headwinds and the opportunities, as well as the growth drivers, which will help India withstand growing challenges emanating from a turbulent economic environment. Dr. Arvind Virmani, member NITI Aayog, one of the leading voices in the Indian economic policy space, has been an advisor to the Indian government at the highest levels for 25 years, including the Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, and Principal Advisor, Planning Commission. I also have with me in the studio my colleague Rakesh Khar, who's joining us right here live. Let's start straight with Dr. Virmani. Dr. Virmani, thank you so much and welcome to News9 Live's Business Plus. First up, I'd like to ask you, and this is basically a look back question. We are at the start of the new financial year and the previous one just ended. So how do you look at the just concluded fiscal in terms of the overall macroeconomic environment?
I think we are on track. There's a timeline which was given by the Finance Commission, which the government had more or less accepted, and we are on track on reducing the fiscal deficit over the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, and while the numbers are of course looking good, how do you see the current fiscal panning out?
Well, the tax collections have been equal to or more than what was projected, so I expect it to be on track or even better than was projected most recently.
Okay, we'll come to taxation in just a bit, Dr. Virmani, but inflationary pressures are rising globally, and in India too, inflation continues to be an issue. I mean, yesterday we saw, of course, the RBI kept the rates unchanged and has taken a pause really and has said categorically it's not a pivot, it's just a pause. But overall, how do you see inflation shaping up in the near term?
So inflation is the million-dollar question. People talk about a lot of factors, including interest rate changes, etc., etc. But to me, the most critical element is oil prices. So if oil prices stay, let's say, at or not much more than $80, you would have one situation. If they go up to $100, there'll be another situation. So really, that to me is the difficult part. So inflation in India will depend a lot on what happens to the rest. We can manage. There's obviously a monetary and fiscal part. But the key external shock which is critical for controlling inflation is really the oil price.
Right, Dr. Virmani, we'll come to oil-linked inflation and the cut that we've seen by the OPEC plus countries in just a bit. But Rakesh, if I can shift focus to you. We saw, in fact, yesterday on our show, we had two very eminent voices, an economist, Karan Mehrish, as well as your friend, a senior journalist, Shobhamoy, both sort of alluding to the fact that the external shocks to inflation will actually not be as significant as the internal shocks arising out of food inflation. And that is what the RBI's MPC has also reflected yesterday. So, how do you see the two really playing out, internal and external shocks?
Couple of points, Karthik. One, that it's a big guest we have today with us. He has lots of years of experience. He was Chief Economic Advisor. I had an opportunity to interview him a couple of times then.
Right.
And then, if he's talking about global risks, he has done a stint at World Bank and IMF.
Right.
So I think he understands global economic scenario much better than any of us sitting here, including my friend and in Business Standard, who was a journalist who had a point of view. But very important, the RBI governor in his press conference yesterday did mention that essentially our discourse is driven by domestic perspective.
Right.
So in that sense, it has to be a fair balance. And if Mr. Virmani is worried about external shocks, we cannot discount it.
Right. So, Dr. Virmani, let me actually then come back to you with this, that with OPEC plus countries taking the sudden decision to cut production of crude, how much of an adverse impact is this really going to have on inflation?
Well, as I tried to point out, the oil prices will go down less than I had anticipated, because as I said, I am an optimist. So, but I've had to come back to 6.5. I haven't come back, but the upside, I believe there was an upside potential which in some ways has been dampened by this rise. and it's all related. You see, it's not that something will happen, then there'll be a monetary policy response, there'll be a fiscal policy response, etc. So one can the net effect on inflation, like I said, after all this management happens, would really depend on the oil price.
Right, and 6.5 of course is bang on, and that's exactly the RBI's growth projection as well, and pretty much in sync with the projections of World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and a lot of other agencies and a lot of other economists as well. And of course, like you've said, that it's going to be critical to watch out for the movement of fuel prices, and let's see what sort of per barrel cost and a per barrel price we arrive at. But we also mentioned fiscal policy. So how do you think the government's sort of fiscal and monetary policy need to work in tandem with each other?
So the primary responsibility of dealing with inflation is with the RBI. RBI is fully aware of it. I have been on their advisory committees both under the previous governor and in this one. And in fact, one of the people who was my senior advisor when I was at IMF became deputy governor. So they are fully on board. They know how to manage. They've done a reasonable job, and I'm sure they'll continue to do it. As far as the government's fiscal is concerned, I mentioned to you that the government's fiscal management during the COVID and even during the Ukraine crisis has been excellent. I mean, I would certainly give an A to both. Those are the areas where the management has been very good. So we are in a good place to manage any future shocks related to inflation.
Right, we are in a good place. Rakesh, of course, Dr. Virmani is saying that the RBI has done whatever it could, and yet the core responsibility of managing inflation rests with the RBI. But to my understanding, Dr. Virmani, sorry if I'm disagreeing with you slightly, but to my mind, the RBI can only do as much in terms of tinkering rates.
Absolutely.
Isn't the responsibility of inflation equally split between the RBI and the fiscal policy under the Ministry of Finance?
I mean, I also tend to disagree with Mr. Virmani, but he's purely speaking from a textbook economics.
Right.
He is not wearing the hat of a politico-economist.
Right.
The truth of the matter is that, the political capital or the political dividend or the political liability of inflation management rests equally with the government.
Okay.
I mean, if inflation becomes an election issue, Karthik, the responsibility and the results and the consequences.
Inflation is always an election
absolutely
issue.
No, it's a question of how you milk it, Karthik.
Right.
I mean, last election, 2014, inflation was a big issue. You remember Prime Minister, then a candidate, said that, Diane Margay, he quoted the old Hindi Bollywood song.
Right. That's 2014 you're talking about.
2013-14, that's right. Yeah. 2019, it was not as much of an election. So credit goes to this government that it could push off inflation from the agenda as an election issue.
Also because overall, I think we saw the slowdown, so to speak, begin to happen only in 2019.
Absolutely.
And towards the end of 2019. And then, of course, COVID took all the brunt of it, rightly or wrongly so. And then we talked about the K-shape recovery. But then again, a K-shape recovery from a rock bottom negative territory to sort of, receding upwards. But then again, what else can the government do if there are both internal as well as external shocks, which are fairly evident right now, whether it is oil price, whether it is food inflation?
So on the fiscal side, the entire responsibility is with the government. That's, expenditure and the revenue management.
That's
These
right.
are the two core pillars of fiscal policy. So I think they've done well on the expenditure side. Public investment is at a very large high. I mean, that's one key factor which has been driving the economy.
Right.
But my worry again in election year, the government has to do a balance between issuing out SOPs, that's the expectation.
Right.
Under whichever category or cluster you put it. And then also being fiscally prudent. But now that is the big challenge. Fiscally, we are, slightly again over the average or the comfort zone of both RBI and all economists.
Right.
And, when the macro picture is viewed, this could be a challenge. But, putting more money into expenditure for infrastructure versus thinking of a new scheme. I do expect that the government will probably hike the farmer, quarterly outgo.
Okay.
And it has so far resisted the idea of UBIC, Universal Basic Income Scheme.
That's right.
But it could probably bring in an alternative because inflation this time, unlike in 2019, is indeed an issue. And the government, especially the Congress party, has been using it as one key plank. along with corruption.
But how bad is 5.2? 5.2 is a projection the RBI
Karthik,
gave
you and I
yesterday for
discussed
the year.
numbers. For the common man, word mehengai mar gayi. If it sticks, they're not going to look at numbers.
But something costing 100 rupees now going on to cost 105 rupees at a time when overall there is an economic growth as well at 6.5%. Is it a bad number?
So, academically, it's not a bad number. But when you consume your fuel, we have had a very high 110 rupees petrol in Delhi. So, that is in recent imagination. And what is most important today is the food prices, the milk prices that each one of us is consuming is hurting the common man. I don't think the government will just need to could wish it away. It is a concern.
Sure.
It's a question of how you sort of say canvas this particular perspective in election as an issue and how it sticks out and what is the traction.
Got it. So you spoke about the government's fiscal responsibility, and we'll come back to that, especially on the tax collection front, which has been fairly robust. But let's go back to Dr. Virmani. Dr. Virmani, let's talk about exports. We'll come back to the fiscal story, but from a CAT perspective, let's talk about India's exports. And they've done fairly well. Service exports too have shaped up. But given the sort of, all-round recessionary fears that we talk about, especially those coming from our western part of the globe, do you think that we'll be able to sustain this sort of tempo that we've arrived at on the export side?
Yeah, so the service exports is really, there are two big changes which again in 1921 we had indicated. One was this whole phenomena of work from home and work from anywhere, and the second was supply chain diversification. We've already talked about the second one, so so the work from anywhere is really what is setting this up, that our service exports are doing even better than many people anticipated, and this phenomena will continue. So here in a sense the change has already happened, across the world. People are looking to India for new types of service exports because of this work from anywhere type of attitude which has changed. Like I mentioned, this contrasts somewhat with the production, which is slower for many reasons, because services there's less fixed costs, there's less sunk costs. It's very easy to change. If you have getting imports or getting somebody to do it in San Francisco or somewhere else, you can now with this work from anywhere, you can get it from the same person could be sitting in Portugal or India. So it's very fast. This has already happened and it will continue.
Okay, so exports of course is one side.
That's right. So there you have a recessionary trend, but you have this other longer term trend, and by and large on net we will keep doing reasonably well. Okay. That does not mean we'll grow at the same rate. Obviously recession will reduce the rate of growth, but we will do better than others, because of the underlying trend.
Understood. I agree with you, Dr. Virmani, but let's just shift focus to something that Rakesh was alluding to earlier, which is on public investment. And public investment has injected, of course, a lot of robustness in the economy as well. And with the election year sort of coming up, do you see the government, the centre as well as the states really being able to stay the course on public expenditure, public investment?
Yeah, I have no doubt that stay the course. I don't know what you mean by that, but the capital increase is in the budget. We will implement it. The government will implement it because we know that this has huge multiplier effects, and as private sector has pointed out, they needed room for the capacity utilization to increase and for them to accelerate their capital expenditure. So government is committed to it. It will happen in this year. That's all one can talk about. What happens next year we'll discuss.
Right. So that's what I meant by staying the course, Dr. Virmani, that it has continued making public investments and it is likely to continue to do so, hopefully, because those announcements have come in the budget as well. But on the demand side, how do you see the situation now? Especially, we talk about two eras. There's a pre-COVID era and there's a post-COVID era. And there's a lot of talk about this pent-up demand. And do you think that pent-up demand has finally exhausted? And in the same light, I'd like to ask you, rural economy has not yet fully recovered, so to speak. So what are your comments on that, Dr. Virmani?
So here is where I think people are, I wouldn't say wrong, but limited. You know, a lot of people are stuck in COVID. Now, COVID had serious effects on the world, on India, but we would have come out of it in 22, 23 after the second wave, but for Ukraine. So, what they are not seeing is the compounding effect of Ukraine on the post COVID recovery. So, to me, those who do not separate out these effects or see them clearly will get the projection wrong. So, to me it is not just COVID, it's the oil price. It's the big increase. If everybody has forgotten, last year oil prices touched $120. That's disastrous. Okay, luckily they didn't stay there. So, the effect of that is on consumption. Everybody keeps saying private consumption is weak because of the poor and less well off have less income, but that would not have been true if oil prices had not gone up. So, they are still attributing that to COVID. I think that is wrong. That's wrong analysis. I am not saying that's not correct analysis. The correct analysis is there was a COVID effect on current. I am not talking about the savings and wealth, that is a whole different subject, but the current effect had gone, and if Ukraine had not occurred, you would have seen a complete recovery in private consumption. That has been delayed, and as I indicated to you in the context of inflation, that will depend on whether oil prices stay close to 80 or again go back to 100.
Okay.
If they stay close to 80, I have no doubt that private consumption will recover strongly in the next year.
Sure. Since you're speaking about, Rakesh, if I can get you in now, since we are speaking about oil prices again, and we are talking about how much of a dent that is likely to make to the economy and to our growth per se. But on the export side, what are the sort of numbers that you were running through?
Well, it's interesting. We have a buoyancy in exports for the fiscal that has just gone
That's
by.
right.
But that's micro picture to my mind.
Okay.
Let me put exports from India in the global context.
Okay.
750 billion or 760 billion, as the minister said, that we could close possibly once we settle down the numbers.
Yeah.
Versus $36 trillion in the calendar of 2022.
That's right.
So, because they follow the calendar. So, it's not even a small 0 point some percentage.
Right.
I'm not trying to say that, we should not have an aspiration. $2 trillion is a good aspiration.
Okay.
And what we must realize the challenges are. The first challenge is that wherever we have a head start, there is competition picking up.
Correct.
And then pricing advantage that we have is also under threat.
Okay.
So emerging economies are challenging us in the IT and the BPO sector. Similarly, in the services sector, where we are opening a big new window, there are some promises of the GCC, Global Capability Centers, where they have identified India, but that's medium to long term.
Right.
These are big ticket ideas, but they'll take time to come through. So, in the foreseeable future, our balance of trade situation is going to be a little difficult.
Okay.
And if oil acts funny in terms of its pricing, we'll have to keep a watch and keep on sustaining and diversifying our export window.
Okay.
Now, this one idea of one district, one export potential, linking export potential to each district is interesting.
Right.
There is an example in UP of UDAP, which I think we discussed
One
earlier.
district, one product.
So, one product is being linked to an export scenario.
Okay.
How feasible it is, but at a vision level, I think it's a workable idea.
All right.
So, on export, these are early days. Let's not get too excited, Karthik. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm being positive,
Sure.
but put it in global context.
Sure. So let's not talk about exports right now. Let's actually shift gears to private investment and the animal spirits that we talk about. So, Dr. Virmani, why is it that private investment has actually failed to pick up as per government estimates?
No, I don't think government has given any estimates of private. I expected it to pick up in the second half of the last meaning, it's over now.
Yeah.
In the last fiscal year. Well, my sequence was a full recovery in contact services, which has happened, followed by a recovery in housing, which from whatever I hear is happening. Again, we don't have the full data because we don't get that broken up so much, and I expected private investment in industry and things like that to be the last to pick up. That may have been delayed by a quarter or two because of the point I just made, which is the effect of oil prices and Ukraine on private income and consumption, but given the stabilization, I would expect that to happen now in the next 2 quarters. So why didn't it happen? Because Ukraine happened. Nobody predicted Ukraine.
Right. So we keep coming back to external forces, and unfortunately, that's the reality today, that we live in an interconnected world. Rakesh, I'll just come to you, but Dr. Virmani, if I can stay with you for a little while longer. Now, the ripple effect, or the sort of divider effect, the opposite of the multiplier effect of private investment not happening, is actually unemployment. And unemployment, especially in an election year, is bound to be a big issue. So how do you see this really panning out? And what are the short-term and medium-term solutions that we have at our disposal?
The myth that employment has gone down, there were of course fluctuations in the COVID time, right? But the latest PLFS data, there are now 2 articles or 3 articles, I think in the Times of India, by people whose research I generally respect. One by Dr. Bhalla and his partner, his co-author, and one by Dr. Goldar, Vishwajit Goldar, who is an old respected professor I know from like 20 years. In fact, he worked when I was at ICRIER. And those show actually that employment has gone up between 2019 and 21, if I remember was their last data, and it's gone up in manufacturing. And not only has it gone up in manufacturing, it has made up the decline which happened between 2011 and 2017. So this assumption, based on little surveys and things like MSMEs, number of MSMEs during COVID, etc., is not supported by a full comprehensive survey which is now out. All the data is there. People who believe this should go and look at that data. It's all available. It's all on the website. You can download it, all the detailed data. So these 2 authors have done it, and they actually showed there is no real issue of employment. Again, let me say that there are temporary effects. There were effects of COVID, there are effects of oil price. So the wage rates may not, the real wages, inflation, right? Real wages is nominal wage minus inflation. Inflation has gone up due to external shocks. As soon as it comes down, real wages will go up. So the real wages may not have gone up, and for some categories may actually have been gone down, but it's not an employment problem. Employment has actually done very well, and the real wages will recover as soon as the oil prices stabilize.
Sure. I think one will obviously have to study the data like you mentioned, Dr. Virmani, but is unemployment really under check? Rakesh, are we in a comfortable situation as far as data goes on employment and real wages that Dr. Virmani just mentioned?
Dr. Virmani is talking about a certain period from COVID and post-COVID.
That's right.
It's been very volatile, the data,
correct,
as he pointed out rightly.
Right.
There's been some uptick, and it has coincided with the larger uptick in the economic cycle and the economic circle.
Okay.
But that doesn't take away the core of the issue. The core of the issue is that India is predominantly young country.
Right.
And that is supposed to be India's biggest advantage.
Right.
Are we playing to the advantage? Everybody, basic common sense would say that we are not. We're not. So what are we doing with our dividend, which is supposed to be a dividend?
Right.
I would say that it needs far greater attention, both from NITI Aayog, which Mr. Virmani is driving as a key thinker there, and given his entire experience, we need to sit with the industry, create a very emergency kind of a situation, and all this is linked to my mind to manufacturing.
Okay.
Unless and until services cannot drive employment, neither can agriculture. People are moving away from agriculture.
That's right.
So it's only manufacturing, whether you like it or not. Manufacturing, we are today a laggard.
Sure. So let's move to manufacturing, and let me take that question to Dr. Virmani. So, Dr. Virmani, my colleague Rakesh Kar here saying that we've been a laggard in manufacturing, but the manufacturing sector has also displayed some expansion, and especially in the month of March, due to overall increased productivity and the order book shaping up. In fact, even the S&P Global PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, has risen to 56.4 versus, I think, 55.3 or something in the month of Feb, 1 month prior. So, what do you make of India's growth numbers, especially when we talk about manufacturing?
No, good and better. The actual number doesn't really matter. PMI is not like any other data. It's just a sentiment of X number of people. It doesn't measure it's not a scale. It just tells you that so many percent of the people surveyed are going to expand their business. That's all. It doesn't tell you how much they are expanding it by. So, but it's just an indicator which shows that manufacturing is doing much better than what people have been saying. Exactly, it supports my earlier point I made on employment in manufacturing.
Okay. Sure. So, of course, it's an indicator, and it's not really, it's based on a survey like you mentioned. But let's talk about the consumption side then. We are fairly okay as far as numbers go on the consumption side as well. So, we've seen car sales have reached a record high. Housing sales are looking good. Overall cracking what I think there's an estimate of a 14% growth in passenger vehicles. So, what's your outlook on consumption? And I'll come back to rural consumption. So, especially on the rural side, which seems to have taken a little bit of a hit, in fact, more than a little bit of the hit if you talk about two-wheeler sales, for example.
Two-wheeler sale is a very specific issue which I have been monitoring for the last 2-3 years, which in a way is indicator of the not of the economy as a whole, not of the recovery, but the losses suffered by people because of the pandemic, right? What happened during the pandemic? Those people who had wealth had a reduction in wealth. Those who had little bits of savings had to use up their savings to continue, despite the fact that the lowest income people benefited from the food, so it didn't affect their current income, but many people still had to dip into their savings. So really it reflects that effect of the pandemic on all Indians,
Sure.
Now if you see in the latest data, we are now finally beginning to see an uptick. Up till now the last but one data showed a decline, but there is now an uptick. So, I am hopeful that this the problem is now over, right? Legacy, you can call it a legacy problem, right? You had this huge thing, there was a lockdown, there were all kinds of disruptions, people's had to shift, some people had to go to rural areas, go back and forth, some companies had to close, some could go on. So, there was this huge disruption from which everybody suffered. So, in some ways you could say it was a reflection of that suffering, but what the data shows is that we are finally beginning to come out of it. So, the graph is definitely up. I expect this upward movement to continue,
of course,
and be reflected in this two-wheeler demand.
Sure. No, I hear you, Dr. Virmani, but let's actually move away from the COVID era, and hopefully that's behind us, and move to tax collection. So Rakesh was just speaking about the fiscal prudence which is required, which is the government's revenue and expenditure. But we've seen that both direct and indirect tax collections are higher than expected. They've beaten, in fact, even the revised estimates. And GST collections have jumped some 13%. Direct tax, individual tax collections have jumped some 24%. So tax collection numbers are auguring well for the government. Isn't that right?
Well, I think I've already said that the fiscal situation is good, and part of it is the very good fiscal and monetary management during the both during the COVID and through this oil shock of last year.
Sure. Now, I just want to quickly, in the interest of time, jump over to UPI, and this is something that India has really shown the light for the rest of the world to as well. And I know Rakesh is also a great proponent of UPI. I'll come to him in just a bit. But Dr. Virmani, take us through India's digital progress. UPI transactions volume, they are at 280 million transactions per day. It's a fairly decent indicator of India truly going cashless now. So, what's the penetration like? What are the targets on the UPI front?
So, I don't have any digital numbers or targets, so I cannot really comment on that. But I do believe, and I've written about this, that the digital economy is going to be a very important driver of growth over the next 3 to 5 years. Besides that, supply chain and the other things we've talked about, the services, supply chain, the digital economy, because that will really take the modern economy out into every area of the country. It just was not feasible. The combination of the huge highway program, which has happened, which you all know about the speed and the extensiveness, coupled with this connectivity and the entry of the digital economy is going to transform the rural and remote areas of the country. But again, it's a slow process. We have to get there. We have to make sure everybody is connected, and then you will see a big transformation happening. But again, it's like a exponential curve. There will be a period of build up, and then you'll see the huge transformation, which I would expect to see around about 3 to 5 years from now.
Okay, 3 to 5 years and the exponential curve. Rakesh, you are one of, I think, the biggest proponents of UPI and the digital dividend that India is enjoying at the moment. Take us through what are the kind of projections that you have for this entire digital economy to pick up?
I think the first immediate projection, it's right there in front of us, is the number of transactions.
Yeah.
So when we link it to the consumption story, who is transacting?
Right.
It's the ordinary Indian consumer.
Correct.
And so obviously when he is transacting, he is doing business,
Yeah.
which means he is buying something.
Correct.
So in that sense, it's a huge indicator of the consumption story.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I'll come to UPI later. On the rural economy and the overall consumption story, this highway project, the entire infrastructure push, has also helped transmit money right to the bottom of the pyramid.
That's right.
So, we may not realize it at the front. We talk about a big corporate having backed that contract and making, made a virtue of it from the government point in terms of execution and for the corporate in terms of scaling up.
Right.
But it's also translating into a bottoms of the pyramid economy,
Right.
which we're slowly, unfolding.
Right.
And, the challenge on consumption is monsoon. Which again, I think, is something that is in nobody's control.
Of course.
And weather is behaving very erratically, so we really don't know what is going to happen. On the UPI bill, I think what India did right with this digital India architecture is phenomenal. The whole world is celebrating it. And there is not just noise, there's a lot of substance in this.
Right.
Because there is this criticism that too much of headline management, but this is truly a global success story.
Right. We've seen 17 countries adopt UPI now.
And again, these are early days.
Of course.
So my own view is that we have seen the front end.
Right.
When you talked about the transactions.
That's right.
We've still not seen the back end.
Okay.
See, the entire machinery in terms of business is unraveling as we speak.
Okay.
Because enabling these transactions is an entire ecosystem, what we call the digital economy system, digital economy ecosystem, which Mr. Virmani also referred to. I do believe, and I've read that experts globally are talking about this being a key driver for Indian economy going forward. We don't actually, figure it in, because we talk about manufacturing, we talk about, services, we talk about agriculture, which has its pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
This is unfolding, and the best part of digital economy, it cuts through the traditional barriers.
Right. Great. Cuts through the traditional barriers. Rakesh Khar, thank you so much. Always a pleasure having you. And thank you, Dr. Virmani. We are completely out of time, but your inputs and all your wisdom and experience comes to light every time that we are in conversation with you. So thank you so much for joining us. That's a wrap from this studio. But my colleague Amit Ranjan, of course, is standing by with none other than Sanjeev Sanyal in an exclusive conversation to take forward, of course, our understanding and the road ahead for the Indian economy. Thank you so much for watching Business Plus. It's over to Amit Ranjan.
Today we are joined by author, historian and member, Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Thank you for being with us, sir. My first question is, global economic agencies have been bullish on India, but now they are downgrading their own estimates with limited spillovers from the projected global slowdown. How do you look at these projections right now?
So, the fact is that it's quite obvious that the world economy is under stress. So, although we are outperforming the rest of the world, and we will be by some margin the world's fastest growing economy of any size, the fact is that there is some spillover to us, and we have also had to tighten our own monetary policy and so on. Given that context, as you know, the economic survey talked about GDP growth in this financial year of somewhere in the range of 6.5%. Now, that is a very good economic growth rate given the context, but it is slower than what we were doing last year. So, in that is, I think, the context in which there have been some reductions in the numbers for India and the world for that matter that have come through.
So as the fiscal unwinds, there are external shocks that come from almost nowhere. The latest being the OPEC plus decision to basically cut down crude production by almost 1.1 million barrels. How much of this will impact India? We are buying from Russia, so how much of this will impact India?
So of course we are importers of oil. So anything that keeps oil prices up is something that hurts India to the extent it has impact on the price. And even if we are buying it from other sources like Russia, the fact is that the average price is affected. First of all, we are not buying everything from Russia. Secondly, even our own bargaining position vis-a-vis Russia is impacted by what the world price is. So the fact of the matter is that higher oil prices does hurt us because we import so much of it. Having said that, there is an important thing you need to take into account here, and that I think we need to have a global conversation about this. You see, one of the ways in which world economy self-equilibrates is that when there is a slowdown, commodity prices come off, and that cools off the system and allows self-equilibration, a kind of self-adjustment internally in the system. Now, if oil prices are unable to adjust downwards in the face of falling economic activity, then an important price signal to the system is not flowing through. And so this is actually unfortunate, because effectively what is happening, that in an environment where inflationary pressures would have otherwise eased off as oil prices declined, that is not going to happen even though the world economy is slowing, because there are, there is a monopolistic holding of a critical commodity price. So I think this is unfortunate, because ideally what should happen is that prices should go up and down as demand and supply dynamics move, and that is not happening now, and I think that needs to be a global conversation on this.
Impact on India, how much?
I mean, obviously there is an impact on India if the world economy is slowing down, but oil prices are not declining. So to that extent it affects our current account.
Do you see a shift in the global economic order, Japan being the latest to go towards Russia to get buy oil?
I mean, it's a complex issue. I mean, there is many things going on in the world, as you know. There is there's the economic friction between the US and China. There is the Ukraine war. There is a wider issue about global supply chains being reoriented. So multiple things are going on, and this decision by Japan needs to be seen in that context. Like India, Japan is a major importer of energy, and clearly they have also decided that their national interest lies in being able to access this energy cheaply.
Okay. Moving on, sir, the war on inflation is now basically something that economies across the world are fighting. India is facing an election year. Inflation is obviously an election issue. There are voices already across. What is a comfortable level, according to you, of inflation, keeping in mind the citizen's perspective?
Well, we have a well set system of inflation being targeted in the 2 to 6% range, which is a good place. That's, I think, what we as a country have agreed is the range we want to keep inflation. So that's the range we will want to target it in. Now, the question is, how do we respond to what's happening in the rest of the world? But do remember that unlike the rest of the world, we did not go out there and splurge our fiscal and monetary resources irresponsibly. We were very responsible through the entire COVID cycle, and consequently the inflationary pressures in India are much more muted than they are in many other parts of the world. By the way, my own view is that inflation, for example, in the US is being understated by their headline number. Anyone who has been to New York or London recently will tell you that there is no way that the inflation numbers reflect the correct situation. So given that context, I think we have done well to manage inflation, and as you will have seen, the Monetary Policy Committee has in fact decided to pause in the latest meeting. And I think that is absolutely correct. I think both the governor and other members of the Monetary Policy Committee have correctly judged that India has for the time being tightened enough.
That was exactly my next question. But again, the answer I'm searching for is, this being an election year, do you think we'll be able to?
I am nothing to do with elections or not is of no concern to me. I am a technocrat and I'm giving you a technocratic assessment.
Okay, talking about growth, there is a view that India is a classic case of jobless growth. Do you agree with this perception? That is one. Two, how do we ensure growth that leads to all-round employment?
So this debate about jobless growth is an absolute red herring. There is no example in history of there being job growth without overall economic growth. Now you can nuance it a little bit here or there, but the fact of the matter is that overall economic growth is a necessary condition for creating jobs. So first of all, this idea that you can somehow create jobs without growth is a completely not even a matter to be discussed. Now having said that, yes, we can, certain kinds of growth may generate more jobs than others, and in this context let me say that we are trying very hard to make sure that there is a balanced all-round range of jobs that are created, because remember, different people have different skills, aspirations and other socio-economic capabilities. So we therefore always make the case that we need various kinds of jobs being created, because we have a very variety of population with different, as I said, different abilities. So that is why, first of all, I have strongly disagreed for a long time with, for example, Rajan's view that we should try to only go for service-driven growth. I believe we need to have manufacturing, we need the construction sector, we need many other sectors. Now, this is the reason, for example, that we have given huge emphasis on, for example, infrastructure build-outs. It is well known that infrastructure creates a lot of good quality jobs for mid-level or lower level, lower skill workers, because construction is very often the first generation of, welding and building, construction work. That kind of activity creates large numbers of jobs, and it happens across the country. Okay, there may be concentrations in a few cities, etc., but it also happens in roadways being built in across the country, or airports being built in smaller towns. So it can be spread across the country as well, and of course it enables new jobs. So infrastructure building creates jobs, and then it enables another round of jobs as new industries, etc., are able to mushroom in those areas where infrastructure has been built out. So with that in mind, we have given this massive push to infrastructure, which you may be seeing, and as you know, the budget this year increased that the outlay by some 33 odd percent. Very big emphasis on railways, as you are also aware, which is again spread across the country, and again gives a good range of jobs.
Thank you, sir. India, if not already, is en route to becoming the most populous nation in the world. Some research shows that it is already the most populous. Would we harness this as an advantage, or would it be a liability, strictly according to you?
Well, we are already, my guess is, my own estimates is that we are now the world's largest population, and also we are now have entered our demographic peak, in the sense that for the next 25-30 years we will be a population where most of the population, or a growing proportion of the population, will be of working age. Now that gives us an opportunity to deploy this population to do productive work at a time when our dependency ratios are low, both for the young and for the old. So in that context, let me say this is obviously an opportunity. What we do with this opportunity is whether it determines whether or not this is good or bad. My sense is that we are generating decent and sustained growth. We can actually grow, my own sense is we can actually grow at even higher rates than we are currently. The underlying structure of our economy now and our infrastructure that's now being rolled out is capable of driving growth at over 8% a year, every year, on a sustained basis. Our biggest constraint to this is, of course, what is happening in the rest of the world, in the sense that if we were growing at 8% today, our current account would be under pressure, because while our imports would go up, our exports would not be able to keep up at the same pace to a slowing global economy. Also, as I mentioned right in the beginning, the fact that energy prices are not being allowed to adjust down. So, in an ideal situation, what would happen if either energy prices are just down, that provides us some cushion, or the rest of the world should be growing, in which case we can export our way out of this. But given the constraint of the external economy, and the fact that the rest of the world is still tightening, there are financial market stresses in financial system stresses in much of the rest of the world, I think the growth rate we are doing at 6.5 is good, but I'm sure in the next few years there will be a period like you got in the years 2002 to 2006 or so, where you also get, just like you get stressed periods, you also get good periods. And whenever we get a good period, our economy is very capable of driving more than 8% growth. So, sustaining even 6.5 at this point in these circumstances is very good, and we should even be able to push it up to 8. So, since we are taking a 25-year perspective of this period, I think we will get these bursts of growth and we will generate the jobs necessary.
Talking about jobs, jobs are primarily linked to private sector growth. Now, the private investment has failed to pick up as per government estimates. Do you see a major this as a major uptick this fixed fiscal?
So, first of all, I disagree that the private sector is not investing. Of course, in any healthy economy, private sector generates most of the jobs. That's what should happen, and it is indeed the case that the private sector is investing, and more is coming in. There is a lot in the pipeline, as you see, build outs in various segments, including our participation in global supply chains. You're seeing significant commitments being made, for example, by multinational companies to India to add us to the global supply chain. So, I disagree with this idea that you don't have investment happening. You can also see that in credit growth numbers, they are decently strong. So, given that investment is reasonably healthy, and the fact is we are generating so far jobs in the services sector, where the jobs created for every rupee that's put in is higher than would be in manufacturing. So, I think I am reasonably confident that we are in a good place. Now, of course, we want to ramp up manufacturing, and as I said, that this is an area where we are seeing a lot of interest in global companies relocating their capabilities here. We are also seeing our own companies going out there, even sectors like, for example, defense, which we have historically not been very strong. We are now beginning to see some growth. I mean, we can do much better than this, but we are now seeing even in sector like defense, where I think the latest number is some 18,000 crores worth of exports were happened in the last financial year. Not bad. We can do better, but not bad. It's a good place to start. So, we are seeing a lot of momentum in many of these areas. Of course, so far, services, as I keep coming back, has been the major driver of growth, both internally and even in exports. And that is, for the time being, our real strength.
Talking of manufacturing, the PLI scheme has seen a certain amount of success. Do you see it getting expanded to more sectors? And also, should we wait for GST tariff rationalization for the new government to take oath? Or should we expect a forward movement in the next few months?
The GST rationalization is always the case. I mean, I have written it's something that is iteratively, continuously improved, and so it's something that's not necessarily run by the central government. Do remember that GST is run by a GST council, and the states have 2/3 of the votes in it. So it is something that's collectively done as a country. I don't think it's related to election cycles. What was the first question? Sorry.
The PLI scheme. Do you see?
Yeah, PLI scheme. Obviously,
what are the sectors you can, do you think it will be expanded into?
One can keep expanding them. So see, the beauty of the PLI scheme is that it's a scheme where unlike other schemes where you put in a lot of resources and some of it works, some of it doesn't work, but if it doesn't work, you have sunk cost. Here there is no such thing. You try a bunch of things, some will work, some will not work, but where it does not work, the government does not actually spend very much money because we have not invested. It retrospectively has to be paid out, right? So only if somebody scales up in the way you had envisaged, it works. So in here, my view is that look at the ones that succeeded, study why they succeeded. Maybe in some cases the existing ones can be tweaked in the sectors they didn't succeed in, or you can come up with new ones where, so it's an iterative process. It's not like, you know, it has to be done once and that's the end of it. It's an iterative process. Some will succeed, some will fail, and as I said, you can experiment like this largely because you don't have to put in any money up front. If it succeeds, that's only when the cost has to be paid out by the government, in which case it is fine because, you know, you paid for what has already worked and you didn't have to pay very much for that which didn't work.
So there is talk of big ticket manufacturing moving to India from China, but when we come down to examples, the example that is given is Apple. Do you see it going beyond that and basically coming to India in leaps and bounds as everybody expects it?
I fully expect large numbers to shift to India. As I said, Apple is just one example. There are others as well. Samsung is here already. Many others are here. Lead firms are a very critical part of this game. As lead firms establish themselves in India and begin to export, one, they provide example. Two, they create ecosystem of people. But also our logistics begins to understand how these things work. So, for example, one of the reasons Gati Shakti is there is to be able to deal with different parts of our logistics machinery to work together. Now, if it works together for Apple, it will work together for many other people. So, it's really about getting our systems, the mindset of being able to deal with global supply chains. Historically, we have not had that mindset.
Moving on from Apple, there is also talk about the infusion of semiconductor manufacturing into India.
Yes.
How far do you think it's true, and how true to the extent is it really going to be a big ticket coming to India, or it will just be little sporadic things where some part of semiconductor manufacturing will come to India?
See, semiconductor manufacturing doesn't happen in small scale. Either it comes in with some amount of scale or it doesn't at all. And we now are seeing a lot of interest and in fact fairly advanced commitments, journey along getting commitments of big ticket investments in this sector. Now, there are immediately somebody said, yes, but it's mostly capital investment and, you know, so many jobs are not created. That's the wrong way to think about it. Semiconductors are a critical ingredient into all kinds of other industry, whether it is defense or it is automobiles or many other things. And one of the lessons of the COVID period is that if for critical ingredients you need to have the capacity on shore, because otherwise suddenly for whatever reason, this time it happened because of pandemic, next time it may be some other reason, a critical ingredient suddenly switches off, then, you know, the whole system jams up. So it is absolutely critical for the resilience of our economy that we have the capability of manufacturing chips.
The world expects or looks at India and China to be the big ticket drivers of global growth. Now, there's a big one. On the one hand, there's a big trade deficit issue between India and China. Do you think India needs to relook at their policy of basically we have differences, but we in one sense cannot do without each other because we have such a big trade going on between our countries? Your comments on this?
So, you know, we have our geopolitical frictions with China, but we can't wish China away. I mean, we will both compete with them and collaborate with them. And do remember, if we are saying that we are going to be a part of the global supply chain, the fact is that China has a very important part of the supply chain. So, by the very nature of our participation in the global supply chain, we will end up having to deal with China. Now, of course, it does mean that we will then have a bilateral trade deficit with them, because many inputs for things we want to export onward will come from China. That is the way the state of the world is as of today. In the long run, we can maybe diversify our inputs, we can do many other things, but even in the longer run, China will remain a part of the game. We can't wish it away. So, what does it mean? Well, we do need to try and find niches where we can export into China, number one. We need to be able to leverage the fact that we are ourselves becoming an important part of the game. But to take a purely bilateral view of trade is probably not a good thing, beyond the fact that there are certain geostrategic issues and also certain resilience issues. If we are completely dependent for inputs from one country, obviously something could happen to the country. We have nothing to do with geopolitics, it may just be an earthquake or something like that. And so you need a certain amount of capacities onshore, and those that you cannot do onshore, you need to diversify sources. That resilience point remains.
Last one on this global banking crisis, looming recession. Will the IT and overall services exports from India take a dip or take a hit because of these?
Well, obviously, the fact that the world is going through major stress and is probably slowing down means that merchandise exports certainly will feel the heat first, and they already have. I mean, Indian exports in the very recent months, as you know, are declining on a year-on-year basis. So are imports, by the way, but clearly there is some pressure that is being built into the world economy. That has not showed up in our services exports yet. Now, of course, one could argue that some part of this is structural, i.e., this is a structural move. The pace of it may go up and down a little bit, but things, we are genuinely created enough cluster, our competitiveness, and it's now feeding on itself, that some of this exports is going to grow, and jobs, services jobs are going to move to India, irrespective of what happens to the global economy, and that is true. Also, by the way, the fact that there are all these inflationary stresses, etc., in Western countries also creates another reason why they may move, because now their corporates are under stress. Ironically, they may actually be encouraged to move some jobs to India just to stay afloat. So it may not necessarily always be bad for us in the short term, but of course, longer term, you want a healthy world economy. We live in the world, we can't, and the healthier it is, the better for us, because that allows us to export to the rest of the world and so on and so forth. But as things stand, we are in a decently good place given all what the rest of the world is going through, and I would say that we have enough buffers in our system to be able to insulate yourself to some extent. But yes, I mean, it would be nice if the rest of the world kind of worked out its stresses and got on with the job of growing.
Thank you, sir. That was Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal telling us that the Indian economy is in a decently good place with respect to the rest of the world right now. Thank you very much, sir.